So if you adjust for inflation, the famous $6 million price tag from 1973 is, it's actually equivalent to roughly $44 million today in 2026.
Which is just a staggering amount of money for a single person.
Oh, absolutely. But back in the early 70s, that multi-million dollar budget bought something entirely unprecedented for television audiences. I mean, we're talking about a cold-blooded, ruthless literary assassin who had to be, well, fundamentally reverse engineered into a living room hero.
Exactly. And welcome to today's deep dive, by the way. We are looking at a massive stack of historical articles and production notes today.
Yeah, we really are. And our mission for this deep dive is to explore the anatomy of a massive 1970s pop culture phenomenon, the $6 million man.
Right. And for you listening, this isn't just some nostalgic walk down memory lane. We're going to see how this single TV show laid the absolute groundwork for how we view human enhancement, cyborgs in media, and even global politics.
It's wild how far-reaching it is. So, to set the stage for you, we are looking at the story of United States Air Force Colonel Steve Austin.
Played iconically by Lee Majors, of course.
Oh, yeah, iconic is the word. So, he's an astronaut who suffers this catastrophic crash in an experimental aircraft. I mean, he is basically brought back from the brink of death.
And he's rebuilt by a government agency called the OSI. They replace his right arm, both of his legs, and his left eye with bionic implants.
Right, which basically turns him into the ultimate secret agent. It sounds like this perfect, glossy superhero setup. But his origins were, well, they were incredibly dark.
Oh, incredibly dark. The entire concept actually stems from a 1972 best-selling novel by Martin Caidin called Cyborg.
Yeah, let's talk about that transition from the page to the screen, because the Steve Austin we all got on Friday nights was definitely not the Steve Austin from that original source material.
Not even close. In Caidin's novel, Austin was essentially just a weapon. He was highly lethal, operating in this very grim, unforgiving espionage world.
Like a completely different vibe.
Completely. And when they first tried to adapt this in 1973 as a TV movie, he wasn't even the classic Air Force colonel working for Oscar Goldman at the OSI.
Right. The sources show he was actually a civilian astronaut at that point.
Yeah, and handled by a totally different character, Oliver Spencer, played by Darren McGavin. And the agency was called the OSO, not OSI.
That first TV movie was a massive ratings hit, though, which immediately spawned two more television movies, right? Wine, Women in War, and The Solid Gold Kidnapping.
Yes, and looking at the production history, those sequels lean super heavily into this slick, international James Bond kind of aesthetic.
It wasn't until producer Harve Bennett stepped in to adapt the concept into a weekly, hour-long series that the gloss was entirely stripped away. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
The character evolution here is kind of like reverse engineering a superhero. Because normally, instead of a normal guy gaining powers and getting edgy or dark, they took a cold-blooded weapon from the novels and actively gave him his humanity back.
They really did. They made him down to earth. A reluctant spy who rarely used deadly force.
But that's what I don't get. Wouldn't a Cold War spy agency actually want the ruthless killer from the novels? Like, why would TV executives actively choose to make their superweapon a reluctant pacifist?
What's fascinating here is the sheer psychology of 1970s television audiences compared to, like, film or literature.
How so?
Well, a novel or a cinematic feature is a contained, temporary experience. You can spend 2 hours with a cold-blooded assassin and enjoy the thrill of the violence.
Right, you get to leave the theater afterward.
Exactly. But television requires you to invite a character into your home week after week. If Austin is just this unfeeling machine who kills without remorse, the audience is eventually going to recoil from him.
That makes total sense. So the viewers needed someone they could actually connect with.
Yeah, a reluctant hero who fundamentally hated the degrading, deceptive nature of espionage. Lee Majors really infused Austin with a profound vulnerability. He didn't want to be a weapon.
He resents the bionics almost as much as he uses them.
Yes, that underlying tension is the engine of the entire show. And finding that exact human element was an incredibly messy process behind the scenes.
Oh, you mean with the casting?
Yeah, look at the casting for Dr. Rudy Wells, the key medical scientist who implants and maintains Austin's bionics. The production burned through 3 different actors trying to lock down the right dynamic.
Wow, 3!
Yep. You had Martin Balsam in the pilot, then Alan Oppenheimer, before they finally settled on Martin E. Brooks as a series regular.
It sounds like they were constantly tweaking the chemistry, just trying to ensure the science felt grounded by a deeply empathetic human relationship.
Precisely. Giving him his humanity back totally solves the likability problem.
And this is a but the moment you make him a vulnerable human, you crash straight into a massive narrative wall.
The power scaling issue.
Right. If this guy has millions of dollars of superhuman hardware, how do you keep the show from getting incredibly boring? I mean, if he can just punch his way through a steel vault and run away at the speed of sound, where is the dramatic suspense?
You have to engineer very deliberate, believable limits. Producer Kenneth Johnson understood that a hero is really only as interesting as his vulnerabilities.
So he instituted strict, unbending rules for the bionics.
Exactly. Tight rules.
I love looking at the actual spec sheet from the production notes for this. It is just so specific. They establish that Steve can jump 2 stories. Absolutely not 3. 2 is the hard limit.
And his bionic left eye is equipped with a 20.2-to-1 zoom lens, night vision, and infrared tracking.
But it has a major Achilles heel, right? Ultrasonic attacks.
Yes, high frequencies cause extreme dizziness and temporary blindness. The parameters for his legs are equally rigid. The upper limit was clocked at 60 miles per hour.
Though, to be fair, there is that one episode where the gauge pushes 67.
True.
But what's hilarious to me is that when they introduced his spin-off counterpart, Jamie Summers in The Bionic Woman, she is shown completely blowing past him, outrunning a race car doing 100 miles per hour.
The writers clearly decided the government's bionic tech had seen some rapid upgrades between those 2 surgeries.
No kidding. But the core limitations remained essential. Then we get to the bionic right arm. It supposedly has the strength of a bulldozer.
Which is terrifying, honestly.
Yeah, and it also, somewhat inexplicably, has a built-in Geiger counter.
Naturally.
Right. But the overarching weaknesses they wrote into the lore are what actually ground the show. Extreme cold literally paralyzes the bionics. Like, if he goes into a freezing environment, he's immobilized.
And cosmic radiation in space causes total system failure.
Here's where it gets really interesting. They treated this cutting-edge, billion-dollar military technology exactly like a modern smartphone battery in the winter. If he gets too cold, he just shuts down.
It's such a relatable flaw.
It is. But wait, I have a highly specific physical question about this setup based on the text. If his bionic arm has the strength of an actual bulldozer, how does his organic human spine not snap in half when he tries to lift something that heavy?
You've hit on the most glaring, brilliant blind spot in the entire series. The show literally never explains it.
Never, not once.
Never. They never address how his flesh and bone shoulder or his organic spine withstands the torque of lifting a 2-ton car.
That is hilarious.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, sci-fi doesn't always need perfect physics. It needs perfect dramatic tension.
Storytelling is about prioritizing emotional stakes over mechanical realism.
Exactly. The flaws, they did establish the freezing, the ultrasonic blindness. Those were relatable sensory limitations.
Right. If the audience is watching Steve Austin struggle to move his freezing arm to save someone's life, they aren't sitting there doing the math on his spinal column.
The vulnerability feels real, even if the physics are entirely broken.
Having those strict rules on paper created a massive problem for the production team, though, because to the naked eye, Lee Majors is just a very athletic guy in a tracksuit. How do you visually and audibly communicate a bulldozer strength or a 60-mile-per-hour sprint on a 1974 television budget without it looking completely ridiculous?
You have to build an entirely new aesthetic of action. And the production team did something incredibly bold right out of the gate, starting with the opening title sequence.
Oh, the crash.
Yeah.
Everyone knows that terrifying footage of the plane tumbling violently across the desert floor.
It's iconic.
I think a lot of people assume that was just highly impressive miniature work or early special effects, but it's not. That is real footage of a 1967 experimental aircraft crash.
Specifically, a lifting body aircraft. The M2F2.
Yeah, for those trying to picture it, a lifting body aircraft doesn't have traditional wings. It looks almost like a flying bathtub, relying entirely on the aerodynamic shape of its fuselage to generate lift.
Which sounds incredibly dangerous.
It was. The pilot, Bruce Peterson, hit the ground at immense speed and tumbled violently. Miraculously, Peterson survived what looks like an instantly fatal accident, though tragically he did later lose an eye to infection.
This raises an important question about the ethics and impact of blending gritty reality with science fiction.
Yeah, how so?
Well, you take that visceral, horrifying footage of a real man nearly dying, and you overlay it with Richard Anderson's theatrical, famous voiceover. You know, gentlemen, we can rebuild him. We have the technology.
It's chilling.
It is. By grounding the fantasy of a cyborg in the bleeding edge of actual perilous human spaceflight, you force the audience to take the premise seriously. It strips away all that comic book silliness.
It tells you immediately that the bionics were born out of real trauma, not magic. And then, once you're actually in the episode, they had to visually depict a super speed.
Right, and they didn't just speed the film up to make him look fast,
No, they went the exact opposite direction. They used slow motion.
which was a technique heavily inspired by the dramatic, sweeping slow motion used by NFL films at the time, capturing the sheer physical strain of athletes.
Which pop culture eventually dubbed Kung Fu slow motion. Using slow motion to depict super speed is totally counterintuitive. It's like whispering to command a room's attention. But it works perfectly to convey power.
Visually, yes. But the illusion is entirely cemented by the audio design.
Oh, absolutely. The electronic dit sound effect, it is permanently etched into the brains of anyone who absorbed pop culture from that era.
It really is.
But looking at the production notes, there's a hilarious historical irony here. That signature bionic sound effect wasn't even invented for Steve Austin.
Wait, really?
Yeah, it actually debuted in episode 4, used for a robotic clone of a completely different character, Major Fred Sloan. The producers realized how effective it was and just quietly retrofitted it to be Steve's iconic sound.
That's amazing. Those creative hacks, the slow motion, the repurposed sound effect, the gritty realism, they didn't just save the budget. They catapulted the concept of the cyborg out of niche sci-fi and embedded it deeply into global culture.
Yeah, the demand for this character was so ferocious that it completely broke the boundaries of a single show.
The immediate symptom of that success was the expansion of the universe. The introduction of Jamie Summers, the Bionic Woman.
They brought her in, gave her bionics, and then, shockingly, her body rejected the implants and she died.
Which, to be fair, was pretty standard television drama at the time. You introduce a tragic love interest to motivate the hero, and then you move on.
But the network severely underestimated the audience's attachment to her.
Oh, big time.
The fan outcry was so massive that the writers had to completely backpedal. They resurrected her using experimental cryogenics.
Literally bringing her back from the dead due to sheer audience demand.
Yep. She launched her own massively successful series, and eventually, through a series of reunion movies in the 80s and 90s, she and Steve finally get married.
But the footprint of this show goes way beyond network television spinoffs. The actual terminology began to bleed into real-world geopolitics.
Yeah, this completely blew my mind while reading through the sources. In Brazil, during the military dictatorship, the government began appointing unelected politicians to office.
Right. Senators, governors, mayors who never faced a public vote.
Exactly. And the Brazilian public needed a way to mock these figures, so they started calling these appointed officials bionics.
It's the perfect subversive slang, really. It highlighted the artificial, unearned, extraordinary power these politicians wielded, directly comparing them to a lab-created television character who was ultimately controlled by the state.
That is just brilliant. And the cultural adaptation happened in the other direction, too. In Israel, the network bought the show but had to completely rename it. They broadcast it as The Man Worth Millions.
Because the phrase 6 million carried an unbearable historical weight in Israel, too closely evoking the estimated 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust.
Right. They recognized the immense pop culture value of the show, but had to navigate incredibly deep cultural trauma just to put it on the air.
It even inspired parody films in Indonesia. The reach was truly global.
But despite all that historical dominance, the franchise suffers from what Hollywood calls the $6 billion curse. Adapting this property into a modern feature film has been an absolute nightmare.
Oh, development hell.
A movie has been stuck in development hell since 1995. Kevin Smith wrote a screenplay. Jim Carrey pitched a comedy version. Mark Wahlberg has been attached to star in a dramatic reboot titled The $6 Billion Man since 2014.
Wow, over a decade.
Yeah, and despite a revolving door of directors and massive release delays, he was still claiming in 2024 that he's hopeful it'll happen. So what does this all mean for you, the listener? I have to ask you, why is it so incredibly hard to get this movie made today? Is the concept just too deeply rooted in 1970s anxieties to translate to a modern audience?
You are hitting on the exact reason the original series was a lightning in a bottle moment. The
Okay.
1970s was a period of intense, specific technological whiplash.
Right, the space race hangover, early computers.
Exactly. The world was experiencing rapid advancements in aerospace and computing, but there was a profound global fascination with space-age miracles clashing directly with fragile human vulnerability.
And the $6 million man perfectly physically embodied that clash.
Yes. Today, we walk around with supercomputers in our pockets. We take bleeding-edge technology entirely for granted, trying to artificially recreate that specific 1970s tension. The awe and the terror of merging man with machine is a nearly impossible puzzle for modern filmmakers to solve.
The context of the world shifted, which means the cultural weight of the hero shifted with it. Well, we've really pulled apart the anatomy of Steve Austin today.
We certainly have.
We've traced him from his violent literary origins as a cold-blooded weapon, watched him get reverse engineered into a reluctant, vulnerable television icon, and seen how those brilliant budget-saving production hacks accidentally shaped global political vocabulary.
There's one final piece of the source material that perfectly encapsulates the dual nature of this entire phenomenon.
Oh.
Well, while the television show was working hard to soften Steve Austin and make him a family-friendly hero, the comic book adaptations were doing something entirely different. They literally split the character in half.
Wait, what do you mean they split him in half?
They published two distinct formats simultaneously. There were standard color comic books, closely following the TV show, bright and geared toward kids.
Okay, pretty normal.
But at the exact same time, they published black and white, highly detailed illustrated magazines. And those magazines were dark, they were incredibly violent, and they were aimed strictly at adult readers, returning almost entirely to the bleakness of the original novel.
Oh, wow. That is a wild contrast.
It is, so I'll leave you to consider this. Does the enduring global appeal of the cyborg lie precisely in this unresolvable duality? Is our fascination with bionics ultimately just the childhood fantasy of possessing unstoppable superpowers, constantly at war with the deeply adult horror of losing our fundamental humanity to the machine?
The childhood fantasy versus the adult horror. Man, what an incredible lens to view this through. The next time you see a cyborg on screen or read about the latest tech breakthrough, ask yourself which side of that battle you're really watching. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the pop culture you consume, look for those hidden layers of history, and we will see you next time.